Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and in the spirit of the trees, the spirit of all living nature, and with deep gratitude for all of our ancestors, I want to greet you to this session of Humanity Rising. We want to turn today to the social issue of sexuality and gender. We're beginning a 3-day program to look at the world of trans. All of us know from the news that gender fluidity, non-binary identifications, all kinds of expressions of gender and sexuality are growing in number and colorful expressions all over the world. We also know that there are forces that are seeking to repress this creative expression of our humanity. Laws have been passed. Transgender individuals, particularly women of color, have been killed. So as we enter into this domain today, it is both a celebration, but it's also a concern, because we'll be touching into a very deep strand in our humanity, and an identity politics, the politics of identity that are fraught with challenge. So that's our program today. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment. But before we do, let us just take a breath and let us center ourselves on our bodies and our expression of our bodies. And let us attune ourselves to our hearts just for a minute. And through our hearts, let us feel our bodies. Let us feel our gender. Let us feel our sexuality, and let us celebrate all the manifestations of what it means to be human. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to commence our program by welcoming Kelsey Pacha, with whom I have been in dialogue for many months, who is the convener of this 3-day program. Kelsey is a trans man. He is the president of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. He has a master's degree and a Master of Divinity degree from Pacifica School of Religion and Psychology. He's been working for 2 decades on these issues. He speaks regularly, he trains, he consults with companies seeking to deepen their commitment to diversity and the skill with which we all need to honor diversity after so many centuries of patriarchy and stultification of human gender and sexual expression. So Kelsey, I want to thank you for everything that you're doing in the world. I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising, and thank you for convening 3 days on this very deep and important issue. And I'll turn the program over to you. Kelsey will make a presentation, and then when he's done, I'll circle back and we'll have a dialogue for the balance of the time. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim, and for everyone at Ubiquity University and Humanity Rising for inviting me here today. My name is Kelsey Pacha. I am really excited to be meeting all of you and to be talking about this very important topic of, what is gender. Can everyone see my screen? Just want to double check. I had to switch computers. We're
You're
good?
good, Kelsey. You're good.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is day one of 3 days that, hopefully we'll be spending together. If you'd like to learn more about what I'm calling gender in 3 dimensions. So this first day is really about looking at these 3 dimensions of gender. So this reflects what's called the biopsychosocial model of gender, which professional organizations like the American Medical Association, American Psychiatric and Psychological Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, National Association of Social Workers, and many others deem to be the best practice when we're thinking and talking about gender. So those 3 dimensions are sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and gender expression. We're going to be talking a little bit about terminology, and especially where do we get mixed up about what is related to sexual orientation versus what's related to gender. And we're going to do a little bit of reflection on our own gender journeys. So these 3 dimensions of gender aren't just about transgender, non-binary, gender expansive people. And if you don't know what I'm saying with those terms, we'll define them in a moment. But it's really about all of us. So all of us have a body, all of us have a gender identity, and all of us have a way that society gives us feedback about how we're performing our gender. And I really appreciated how Jim kind of led us into this conversation, which is to say that if you're not aware, this is really a fraught issue right now. So especially transgender youth and children. In 2021, there were over 200 state laws proposed. Many of them passed, not all of them did, that limited access to gender affirming care, like medical transition, so like hormones or surgery for young people, which is really a rare intervention. A lot of people don't know that, but it's pretty rare for a minor to do medical transition. These laws also targeted youth who want to join athletic teams that conform to their authentic gender, use restrooms, learn about themselves in school, be able to talk about pronouns or be able to say the word gay, which is about sexual orientation, not gender, right? But these kinds of laws have an enormous mental health impact. In 2022 alone, I think there have been 79 laws that have been proposed in state legislatures. There are going to be more, and again, many of them passed. And so when it comes to the conversation that we're having today, part of this is also thinking about how each of us evolves throughout the lifespan, right? So I'll be sharing a little bit about that today and in the subsequent days, but I'll also be just sharing some general information with you about what is considered best practice. So before talking about myself for just a minute, so today is some basics about how do we know what gender is. Tomorrow, we're really going to dig into gender pronouns. How do you ask someone about your pronoun, about their pronoun? Why is that important? And giving some definitions there too. Like, what do I mean when I say gender pronouns, for example? And then I'm so excited to be able to interview Dennis Barron, who is a linguist and who wrote a book called What's Your Pronoun Beyond He and She? And he's gonna tell us about the history of attempts to make a gender neutral pronoun in English, which is fascinating. Goes back to at least the 1300s. And then day 3 on Thursday, I will be convening a panel with a couple of trans and non-binary people to really talk about their experiences. So if you're with us for the whole 3 days, think about what kinds of questions you might have based on the material, and we'll get a little bit more personal. Like, what does this look like for a person in their lives? So a little bit about me. I am a trans man. So what that means is that I was assigned female at birth. So when I was born, everyone thought that I was a little girl, and I identify as a man. I have had a couple of different gender expressions throughout my life. So meaning the way that I look, and usually it's coded in terms of how masculine or how feminine you are. So this photo of me with the long hair, I was actually a pretty feminine girl and young woman, not necessarily because that's the expression that I felt most comfortable in, but because my surroundings, especially my mother, was very intent upon me being a feminine young girl. I grew up in a really small Catholic community in Iowa, not very diverse. I knew everyone, everyone knew me. Um, and so, I wore makeup, I had long hair. But from an early age, about 4, I knew that I was a girl who was attracted to other girls. It wasn't until I was about 20 that I recognized that I was actually a man, right? And that was in part because in college at Northwestern University near Chicago, it was one of my first exposures to the internet, like having the internet reliably. And I found what are called transition blogs. So blogs that people write to document their transition. It never had occurred to me until that moment that you could be assigned female at birth or born female. Assigned female at birth is a little bit more accurate, which we'll talk about in a moment, and to eventually transition and become male. Once I found that out, it immediately resonated in a very spiritual way. So a lot of what isn't talked about in terms of people identifying their gender is that to me, it's a very existential question. It's about deep alignment. It's not an abstract notion of being happy, but it's really about this is the person that I was meant to be from the universe, the creator, God, however you want to kind of talk about that divine, sacred relationship. So between 20 and 25, 21, 25, I was in kind of a gender fluid or gender nonconforming place. Again, we'll define those terms, but that's the photo that's near the right. Sometimes I was perceived as male and sometimes perceived as female. I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in 2008. And because there was more awareness of folks with lots of different gender expressions, I often got misgendered as a woman as people attempted to really honor, oh, this must be like a lesbian woman, right? Short hair, maybe higher voice. I hadn't had top surgery yet. And so I show you these photos and share this to say that what transition might look like for different people, it can be a very kind of broad spectrum. And when it comes to my reflections about what does this look like in a workplace or in a family or in a school, in society in general, I'm speaking from a place of having been firmly in this feminine woman camp, then firmly in this sort of like in between androgynous gender nonconforming camp. And now I, reliably pass as male, have a deeper voice, facial hair. So people readily see me as my authentic gender now. So that also has some kind of different, it's a different resonance, right? Being seen in society versus not, and how that impacted my health and well-being. So I've worked with LGBTQ people for 15, 16 years. My academic background is in social work undergrad, and then I went to Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. So I have a Master of Divinity, which is the professional degree that pastors and chaplains get. I have an MA in Religion and Psychology. So my focus is really on how does religion, spirituality, gender, and sexuality impact mental health? And then a special certificate in sexuality and religion, which explores these intersections. I'm also the current board president of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. We put out a thick book that is modeled after Our Bodies, Ourselves, the feminist health resource from the 70s, but it's written by and for transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive people. Our second edition is coming out April 15th. You can pre-order it now. I just put a link to the Oxford University Press link where you can purchase that, or your local bookstore. That's thought leaders, people in media, academia, lawyers, surgeons across the spectrum that give very good, accurate information about who are we as transgender people and how to be an ally. So to this conversation today, I am bringing personal, academic, and professional perspectives. I wrote the religion chapter for the second edition. I managed our survey of over 2,000 people, and I've published in a couple of other places about the benefits of inclusion for transgender people. So something that I would invite you to think about, often in these trainings, I will send out what's called a personal action plan, which is really a way for you to organize your takeaways. We might all have slightly different takeaways, but all of us do have some kind of inherent resource that we might speak from in whatever our context is, right? We have some kind of power. So if we're working at an organization or a company, what are the ways that we can bring what we learned today to our professional context? What are the ways that we might bring this to our families and communities? So I invite you to think about what can you do with the information that you have, and what more do you want to learn? Where are your growing edges? Alrighty. So now I want to move into talking about, why does this conversation matter? Right? So what does this mean for all of our lives in this particular moment? One thing that I often talk about with folks is how gender and gender expression impacts people in their work life. So without going, I'm not going to go into extreme detail with these slides, but there's a lot of robust research establishing that there's hiring bias related to LGBTQ people. So even though we're focusing on the transgender part of the LGBTQ community today, there are some overlaps with how bias impacts people based on sexual orientation, because as we'll talk about when we talk about gender nonconformity in just a little bit, we often assume that when we see someone who we perceive to be gender nonconforming, so maybe that is a masculine woman, a more feminine man, someone who is androgynous, we assume that perhaps they are gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or queer. And so the bias that happens between managers and hiring practices in terms of how colleagues treat each other often comes back to gender in some kind of way. Many people feel uncomfortable coming out at work, sharing their authentic identities and their pronouns at work. And there are high levels of unemployment for some subsets of the trans community, especially trans feminine people. So meaning people that were assigned male at birth, present more feminine or identify as female, and especially trans people of color tend to have experiences of being fired without cause, not being hired for positions that they're qualified for. And so there are systemic impacts of this. And in terms of the market, I think what a lot of corporations are realizing is that LGBTQ people are brand loyal. So we know who has more affirming practices that protect LGBTQ people. Things that are especially important to trans people would include health coverage that covers gender-related care. In California, that's a legal right, but it's not a legal right in every state. So companies that proactively make that part of their policy in states that don't require it, that is a huge deal. There are some gender-related surgeries that are upwards of $100,000 and more. So imagine trying to pay out of pocket for something that, you know, impacts your daily life, your embodiment. Right. Also things like family leave, competitive pay, and also having robust non-discrimination policies that don't allow colleagues and vendors to misgender you by using the wrong name or pronoun, or to treat you poorly in some kind of way because of your gender presentation. So those are some things to think about, is that especially with younger and younger generations tending to identify in higher numbers as transgender, and especially as non-binary within that community of trans folks, it's very important to pay attention to having a diverse workforce that will make better products and results in better decision making. So that's a little bit of the context in which we're talking, to say nothing about some of the statistics that we'll go over tomorrow about young people and how they are identifying in terms of gender. I'm going to put my email or my website into the chat here for the folks that are live. It's kelseypachaconsulting.com. I have a lot of good blog posts and resources on my website that that could be helpful for your practice. And you can, of course, contact me through my website as well. I wanted to go over a couple of different terms that we might get confused about in terms of what is related to gender identity versus what is related to sexual orientation. So many of us are familiar with terms like heterosexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian. When it comes to words like pansexual or queer, these are words that are being used a lot more often among younger generations, whereas let's say baby boomer generation, even Gen X, would tend to use words like gay, lesbian, bisexual. So I want to just give us a little bit of etymology for where these words come from. So first of all, this word pansexual, if anyone is familiar with Greek, you might be aware that pan is the Greek word meaning all. So folks that identify themselves as pansexual are attracted to people of all genders. So this is often a word that is now used in place of the word bisexual, because what does the prefix bi imply? Two, right? Binary, two. So pansexual folks, what they're saying is, I'm attracted to cis men, cis women, non-binary people, transgender people, people of all the genders in between. However, these words could be used interchangeably. I have people in my life who would say, I'm attracted to all genders, but they choose the term bisexual to describe themselves because that's what feels comfortable for them. So a good practice, and I'll toggle back to these terms in a minute, a good practice for any term, whether it's related to gender or sexuality, is to ask the person, what does that mean to you? And how can I best respect you? Oftentimes we think we're getting information from someone based on the term they use, and we might be wrong. And I'm going to give you an example from my life to kind of illustrate this. I could send you a packet of term definitions. I often do that. I'm not doing that today for two reasons. One is that if you're interested in gender terminology, I would suggest searching GLAAD or GLSEN, GLSEN, or even the Human Rights Campaign, HRC. They have free downloadable terms and definitions that will be perfectly fine to remember some of these terms. But number two, the reason why I'm not sending out a terminology sheet is that terminology is always evolving. What's considered best practice and most conducive to like personal growth versus something that might be more demeaning, it can change rapidly, right? And terminology is culturally and generationally specific. So to go back to our terms, a word like queer, I often ask folks in trainings, because I'm a full-time trainer and educator, I often ask folks, is queer a positive term, a negative term, or a neutral term? And some people say, queer is a bad word. It means odd, it means strange. Why someone would want to describe themselves that way, I have no idea. Other folks will say, queer is a reclaimed word. It's a word that we took back in the LGBTQ community to say the stigma that's associated with being gay, being lesbian, being bisexual, pansexual, it's not our stigma. We're here, we're queer, get used to it, right? That's where that catchphrase comes from. And other people will say, I hear it more as kind of a universalizing term that maybe if folks don't know how they want to describe themselves, it's kind of an umbrella term to say the queer community, right? A word like queer, in my experience, tends to be offensive to older folks for whom it was a word that often preceded violence or harassment. So I was part of a faith community where we had an affinity group and folks wanted to call it, the queer something or other. And an older person said, no, I'm gay. I am not queer. Like, please do not name this group that, because that is a word that has a really negative connotation to me. Whereas the young people were sort of like, no, I'm queer. I'm part of this history of like outcasts and people that were bullied and called freaks. And there's nothing wrong with me calling myself queer. So we don't want to make assumptions about what that word might mean to someone if they use it. And we don't want to identify someone else with that term unless they've told us that that's a term that they like. I identify as a queer trans man. Often when I say that, people will think that I am attracted to men and in relationship with men, when in fact, I identify as queer because in my current gender presentation, people see me as male. They don't see me as a trans man, usually. And I want to keep my connection to the communities of lesbian, gay, and queer women who really shaped my life. So the music I listen to, the pop culture moments that are important to me, my politics are related to me being a young lesbian woman, and people don't see that anymore. So I identify as queer to keep my connection and to let people know, like, I am part of this community, even though I'm in a relationship with a woman and appear to be straight. But you wouldn't know that, right? You would have no way of knowing that whole story unless you asked, like, oh, what does that word queer mean to you? And I guarantee that the next person you ask, what does that word mean to you, will have a different answer. Asexual, the lack of, or non, this prefix. So someone who's asexual doesn't experience sexual attraction frequently, or maybe not at all. I'm telling you the definitions of these terms so that when we look towards the gender identity terms on the right-hand side, we can do a little bit of a translation. So let's start with pangender. So if pansexual means attracted to people of all genders, pangender, pan, Greek meaning all, means someone who feels like I'm all of the genders that have ever existed. So I'm male, I'm female, I'm beyond that. Sometimes I'm in between, I move fluidly, but I'm every gender you could ever think of. Agender, on the other hand, would be someone who says, I don't really know if I have a gender, or I don't know how I would describe it. I'm agender, or I'm non-gendered. Sometimes people use that word. So we can kind of translate with these prefixes a similar dynamic, but we're talking about a person's gender identity. And then finally, genderqueer, which is over here. Genderqueer is also a word that can mean lots of different things to different people. You can think about this as someone who says I'm genderqueer is saying my gender is queer. So my gender is not what you would expect. My gender is unknown. My gender is fluid in some way, or maybe I can't quite put my finger on exactly what my gender is. So I describe myself as genderqueer. Genderqueer is definitely a word that we want to ask, what does that mean to you? And people will have wildly different ways of speaking about themselves. Gender expansive is a word that I use a lot. It comes out of research on youth. In other times, people would say things like gender variant or gender diverse. I like gender expansive because it's just referring to anybody who maybe has different kinds of gender expression over time. Maybe they say different things about their gender identities at different times. It's anyone who is playing with their gender in some way, or isn't consistent necessarily with how they express or identify their gender. So this is its own kind of umbrella term. So on trans bodies, we use the three terms. This is a book for transgender people, non-binary people. We'll define that term in a little bit. Folks that go beyond the gender binary of male and female. And gender expansive. And gender expansive is kind of a catch-all for and everyone else who doesn't necessarily identify with their sex assigned at birth. We're going to define transgender in just a moment. Just so you know, trans means on opposite sides. Cis, CIS, means on the same side. So a cisgender person, that's the majority of the population. These are folks that identify with their sex assigned at birth. So birth certificate, doctor says, I'm a male, I identify as male, then you're cisgender. So a cisgender person is somebody who's not transgender, right? And we'll return to two-spirit. If you've noticed, two-spirit is underneath both of these categories of sexual orientation and gender identity. And we're going to talk about why that is in just a little bit. All right. So just checking in. Okay. There are some different ways to visually represent some of these aspects of identity related to sexuality and gender. So the genderbread person, gender Gumby, the Soji friend are all kind of different versions of this. I like to use this gender unicorn image. I know it's a little bit playful, maybe seems a little bit childish, but I've used this with very young people and older people to kind of think about, where do these parts of my identity live? So the three dimensions of gender are sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression. So we're going to define these in just a moment. Sex assigned at birth is all about our bodies. So on this unicorn, they very helpfully or not locate that within the genitals. The genitals are not the only place that we get information about our gender, but it's the one that people think of most often, right? So we can be assigned female, male, or intersex, or maybe we're not sure at birth, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Gender expression, these are the green dots. So as we're looking at this unicorn, gender expression is all about how long or short is the unicorn's hair? What colors is the unicorn wearing? How do they walk or talk or speak? And what does that communicate about their gender? So gender expression is how we express our gender and how people see us in society based on how we express our gender. Gender identity, this is in the thought bubble of the unicorn. This is all about, what is my deeply held sense of what my gender is? Again, an overwhelming majority of people, this matches what our sex assigned at birth is. For maybe 0.7 to 2% of the human population, it doesn't match. And I just want to note that when we're looking at gender expression, we've got these three spectra: feminine, masculine, and other. And what that's showing is you can do activities with this image where you ask people to plot, okay, what's my sex assigned at birth for me as Kelsey, right? That would be female. If I were to describe my gender expression with like a dot on these lines, how feminine, how masculine, and how much of another gender do I feel like is part of my gender expression? In previous versions of this activity, there would be one line that would say feminine on one side, masculine on another, and androgynous. And what's the problem with that, right? Gender expression includes a lot of different parts of our experience. It includes what we wear and how we groom. It includes our interests. What hobbies do we like? It also includes things like, what kinds of roles do I take professionally or in relationships? And if you think about yourself, which I'll ask you to do more later as well, certain things that we're interested in might be coded as feminine or masculine or something that's gender neutral. But maybe our gender roles are more feminine, and maybe our appearance is more masculine. So I think about someone like my girlfriend, for example, who appears very feminine and is a cis woman, like long hair, makeup, dresses, etc. So most people, when they see her, would think, okay, that's a woman, and they would be correct. And when it comes to the things she's interested in, the things she's good at, and the roles that she takes, she has a lot of masculine interests and roles. So in our relationship, she's the person who does things with the cars. She's the person who uses tools and fixes things. It's not me, even though I'm a man, right? So that's an example of how, in terms of gender role, let's say there's some masculinity there. In terms of gender expression, there's femininity there. It's not a zero-sum game, in other words, right? If you're feminine in one area, that doesn't mean you're less masculine, right? And if you think about yourself, your children, maybe your parents, your grandparents, other people in your community, you could probably think about how that gender expression can be multiplied. There's multiplicity within how we can describe ourselves within each person. Similar to gender identity, a person can identify as highly female, highly male, and highly androgynous or genderqueer or another gender. The attraction piece is just talking about who is the unicorn attracted to physically and emotionally. We can split those apart, but that's not the focus of what we're talking about today. So this is just a visual way to think about these 3 dimensions of gender that we will discuss now. And this is really the foundation of our learning today that will spring us into our other days together. So again, the 3 dimensions of gender reflects the biopsychosocial model of gender. Sex assigned at birth is the bio part. Gender identity is the psychological part. Gender expression is the social part. So I'm curious for anyone who is live on the Zoom right now, why would I use the phrase sex assigned at birth instead of something like biological sex? Is anyone familiar with this? Why would I say sex assigned at birth instead of biological sex? What's the difference? Okay, no one wants to jump in. That's totally fine. I just want to make sure I'm not lecturing at folks and you're totally wanting to jump in. So this phrase assigned at birth is illuminating or referring to the power of the medical profession to determine whether a human is a male or female. And so what I mean by that is when we think of gender in terms of our bodies and how to distinguish between male and female humans, a lot of folks think about chromosomes, so XX or XY. They think about internal and external sex organs. So we have external sex organs that can be observed at birth. So if a set of parents doesn't find out what their baby's gender is before they're born, the doctor will usually take a look when they enter the world and say, oh, I see a penis, that's a boy. I see a vulva, that's a girl. But there are also internal sex organs, right? There's our gametes, our ovaries, our testes. Is there sperm or not? Like, what are the internal structures, which can't be observed unless there's some kind of testing? And there's our hormone levels, which is, do we have normative levels of estrogen or testosterone? Even before kids are born, we can do an amniocentesis or an ultrasound where a technician will say, okay, here's the testing we got back, the genetic testing, here's the chromosomes, or here's what I'm seeing on the ultrasound. This is the kind of baby you're going to have. Many of us, in the way we were educated biologically, have been taught that this is very simple, right? XX equals female, certain levels of, estrogen and progesterone that are higher than, that human's testosterone levels, which creates a vulva and the internal sex organs of ovaries, uterus, etc. And then all of the concomitant qualities for XY baby being male. What a lot of people don't realize is that about 1, maybe even as much as 2% of the human population has some kind of incongruence between these biological markers of the sex organs, chromosomes, and hormones. These folks might identify as intersex, and they might be diagnosed with what are called differences in sexual development, previously referred to as disorders of sexual development. So intersex people are not the same as transgender people, which we'll elucidate in just a moment. But the reason why I bring this up is to say that Oftentimes when people don't want to respect trans or gender expansive people's gender identities, they will say something like, gender identity isn't real. Your body determines your gender. You're either male or female, and there is nothing else in between. And that's really not true. If you know anything about biology, you might be aware that as a human, you can have an XO chromosome profile. That's Turner syndrome. You can have an XXY chromosome profile, an XYY chromosome profile. You can have diagnoses like androgen insensitivity syndrome, which means, and this image right here shows the sexual differentiation process in the womb. So on the right-hand side where you have this flow chart, this is showing how an embryo becomes sexually differentiated and starts to develop structures. And it's all about when hormones are released. So this XY, basically what happens is with an XI embryo, hypothetically, that embryo should release testosterone at a certain point and then develop testes and a penis. If you have androgen insensitivity syndrome, an XY embryo will not respond to testosterone or dihydrotestosterone or DHT, which means that when that XY embryo is born, they will appear to be a female. And it's often not known until that kid is supposed to go through puberty and supposed to start to menstruate, because most of the time those kids are socialized as female. So they think that they're a little girl, their families think that they're a little girl, and it's not known until they're maybe 12, 13 years old and they haven't menstruated yet that they discover, oh, this child has XY chromosomes. And that person, right, that kid has to make meaning out of their gender. Well, so what does it mean for me if now I identify as a girl and I have appeared to be a girl, but I have XY chromosomes, right? And there are lots of other, over 1,000 actually, differences in sexual development that can cause that kind of incongruence. So I bring this up to say that when it comes to sex assigned at birth, as with many other species on Earth, there's a wide variety of the ways that humans have a biological gender. So we can't make assumptions that simply say, XX folks are female, XY folks are male, and to make assumptions that there are certain hormone levels and physical structures associated with that person. Last thing I'll say about this, if you're aware of polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS, this is a somewhat common diagnoses for folks that were usually assigned female at birth, where folks might have trouble conceiving. Usually there are higher levels of testosterone than are considered normal for a woman. They have different fat distribution and metabolism than other women. And there's often like hair growth, more hair growth, body hair growth. And that broadly is considered a difference in sexual development because it's all related to the hormone levels. So I would think about that. Do you know anyone who might have, fall under that umbrella of having a difference in sexual development? One thing I want to mention with sex assigned at birth is that when we are talking about transgender people, so people that don't identify with their sex assigned at birth, like me, I was assigned female, identify as male. Oftentimes there can be this distress that results because of either I don't feel like my body is doing what it should do. I don't feel like this is my body because my gender identity internally is different from how my body looks or feels. And this is called dysphoria. So we can have bodily dysphoria. That's what I just described. So like for me, it was dysphoria about my chest. I never felt like I should have had breasts. It was very distressing to me. I took great pains to hide, conceal, press down my chest, which caused other health problems because I had this deep sense that like, this is not right, that started in puberty. So that's an example of body dysphoria. Social dysphoria is not often talked about, but social dysphoria is, I'm not so much upset about my body, but I am upset that I feel like no one perceives my authentic gender the way that I see myself. So you could have a person who identifies as like gender fluid, so between male, female, masculine, feminine, who feels like, well, I'm not safe in the men's restroom. I'm not safe in the women's restroom. I get looks and bullied either way. And when people look at me, they don't perceive me the way that I perceive myself. And that's an example of social dysphoria, because it's the sense of, I know who I am, and yet why doesn't the world see me the way that I am? Why aren't there safe spaces for me to be who I am and connect with others the way that I am? So dysphoria, bodily dysphoria, is usually one of the prerequisites for getting gender affirming medical care. So, and it's the only reason why that kind of medical care is available to minors. The only reason why a kid would have puberty blockers or take cross-sex hormones is because the distress is so severe that they're self-harming. Maybe they've attempted suicide, or they don't want to live unless their bodies can be aligned with their gender. So this is a real medical mental health condition. And I want us to see it more broadly as it's not always about the body and a feeling of being mismatched with the body, but it can also be social and the way that we're treated that causes dysphoria. Okay. And I invite you to think too, as an empathy building exercise, when you went through puberty, or when, thinking about your friends or maybe your children going through puberty, I know very few people who felt like, wow, that was great. Like, what a breeze. I loved the whole process. Everything I wanted to happen happened. Nothing I didn't want to happen happened, right? I think a lot of folks, when our bodies change and it's out of our control, we can feel like our bodies betrayed us, right? Why does my body look so different from my sibling, right? Why are my muscles like this and not like that? Even things like fertility, right? That we might reach an age where we want to have biologically related children and find that it's more difficult for us than other people we know. And that can cause extreme distress. I have some women who have breast cancer in my family. And if they ever had to have mastectomy, right, they might feel like, well, am I a woman without these parts? If I have to have my ovaries removed, right, or my uterus removed, am I still a woman? So there are some really broad ways that all of us can experience this kind of distress and dysphoria. It's not just about trans people and gender expansive people. So an important term to know related to sex assigned at birth, I've already used a lot. It's this word transgender. This long definition aside, someone who is transgender does not identify with their sex assigned at birth. So again, for me, I was assigned female at birth. I firmly identify as male, so I am transgender. Transgender can also be used as an umbrella term that has a bunch of other terms nesting underneath it, which is what this image shows. So intersex people are on there. That's controversial. I wouldn't agree with that, but the person who made this graphic did. Some folks might identify as male to female, female to male, two-spirit, hijra, which we'll talk about those terms in a little bit, genderqueer. So anybody who transcends what was expected of them based on their sex assigned at birth broadly could identify themselves as being transgender. So let me give you an example of that. It has drag kings and queens underneath here. So the most famous drag queen that I'm aware of is RuPaul. So for anyone who is aware of RuPaul, think about the ways you've seen RuPaul represented in the media, like on Drag Race, RuPaul show, or in interviews, etc. Most of the time when we see RuPaul, what pronouns do we use for RuPaul? She and her, right? Most of the time. We see her in big wigs, lots of makeup, high heels, dresses, hyperfemininity, right? And if you've ever seen an interview with RuPaul Charles, who is the man, the performer who performs the role of RuPaul the drag queen, he firmly identifies as male. He uses he, him pronouns. He's been in a couple of different shows. Broad City, I know, is one of them, as a man. And so it's interesting because, RuPaul, the drag queen, has been in the public eye for about 40 years at this point. And most of the time when we think of her, we're thinking of her as a woman. And yet RuPaul, the person who's performing that role, identifies as male. So in this kind of writ large way, RuPaul is underneath the transgender umbrella because he is performing an aspect of his gender, right, strategically for his work and to express a part of himself probably, but he doesn't necessarily identify as female, right? So in this writ large way of transcending gender ideals, someone like RuPaul as a drag queen could be underneath this broad transgender umbrella. All right. So now we're going to move into talking about gender expression. These are two photos of one of my godchildren. And in a longer training, we would do an activity where I would ask folks, do you think this kid, and it's the same kid, this is not a trick, they're not like fraternal twins or something like that. Do you think this baby is a boy or a girl? And as you're thinking about that question, think about what are the clues that you're looking for to determine whether this baby is a boy or a girl? So think about, is there anything that feels more or less confusing about either picture? Okay, on the left, I'm getting more of this vibe. On the right, I'm getting this other vibe. And think about what are the pieces you're cluing into in order to determine whether you think this is a boy or a girl. So oftentimes people will lift up, well, on the left, we've got a pink tutu. That reads really strongly as girl in our current US society. I know very few parents that would dress a baby boy in a pink tutu, for better or for worse. But then we've also got this blue button down. So it's like we're engaging these two stereotypes on the left, right? We've got pink kind of dress, so that's pretty feminine. Blue button down is more masculine. On the right, we have colors that are labeled as more neutral: green, yellow, brown, gray. We don't see any toys, so we're not getting information about what adults in this kid's life bought for them or things that they might like. So we can think about what we don't see as well. We don't see earrings, we don't see big bows or headbands, which might lead us to believe girl, because this baby has a bald head, right? So often like parents will dress like bald girls with some kind of like bow or other adornment to let us know. So, so far, we think that this kid and this kid thinks that he is a boy. But I like to show these photos because it lifts up for me the reality that oftentimes when a kid is born or before they're born, we can have a lot of questions about who this kid is in terms of their gender. So I remember when I knew my cousin was pregnant with this kid, that they didn't find out the gender at the doctor. It was a surprise. And I remember being nervous about, well, what can I buy this kid? And what is the theme of the room, right? What are the colors they're going to use? What are the, is it a zoo? Is it, the circus? Like what's going to be appropriate and what might offend the parents of this kid if I bought it for them, right? Also, when he borrowed this tutu from his cousin in the picture on the left, all the adults were laughing when we took this picture. And I was out at that time, I was doing this kind of work. And I remember thinking, what is this laughter about, right? This kid doesn't care. If anything, maybe the tutu is more scratchy than the clothing he usually wears. It doesn't matter to him, right? But for the adults, it was this release of discomfort of like, oh, we know that this baby is a boy, and yet we are dressing him in this very gender nonconforming way. And there's some kind of like discomfort we need to release related to that. So I wonder if that's come up in your lives, right? With your kids, your grandkids, neighbors, right? Other people in your community in terms of what is appropriate for this baby in terms of their gender. So gender expression, as I said, this is the social dimension of gender. This is how we authentically express our gender when we have the ability to. So a baby can't necessarily say, I like this, not that. Like, I want to wear this, not that. But at a certain point in toddlerdom, usually, that is something that happens, and kids begin to give opinions about how they want to look, how they want to dress, what they want to play with, what they're interested in. So there are two parts to gender expression. What we were just talking about is gender presentation, which is what is someone wearing? How long or short is our hair? What colors do we wear? Do we wear skirts, dresses, pants, sneakers, high heels, all of the above? How much makeup do we wear, if at all? Do we have piercings, and where are they? What other kind of jewelry do we wear? Even things like our mannerisms, the ways that we gesticulate, how much our vocal intonation goes up and down, how we walk, how we like move our hips or move our legs, all of those things communicate something about our gender to other people. This person is Jaden Smith, who is Jada Pinkett Smith and Will Smith's son. As you can see, he is wearing a dress in this photo. He wore a dress to his prom, and I think he was in a Gucci campaign wearing skirts and dresses. And he's famous for going on Twitter and saying, I'm not wearing girls' clothing, I'm just wearing clothing. And I think he's a really good example of how younger generations are saying, boys section, girls section, boys toys, girls toys, whatever. I like what I like. I'm shopping and I'm going to express myself the way that I want to. I don't care how it's being labeled. Right? So whereas gender presentation is how we want to express our gender when we have the ability to, gender expectations are sort of the opposite. This is what society is imposing upon us. And this is different, right, from a US context to a Philippines context to a South African context, right? All around the world in different subsets of cultures and across time, right? 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, these gender expectations can shift, right? For what's appropriate for men to do, what's appropriate for women to do. We can see gender expectations really clearly in marketing. So I already mentioned the boys and girls section of a store, or men's and women's sections of a store. This Bic for her pens. So Bic has been making pens forever. I think in about 2013, they came out with this product, Bic for her, which had pastel colored casing and were slimmer. Because presumably women and feminine people were like suffering under the weight of the previous pens that Bic had made. And if you go on Amazon, they got roasted in the reviews for releasing this product because people felt like, why is this marketed towards women? Why do women need a slimmer pen? We didn't ask for this, right? Why is this about gender at all? Why not just call it like Bic Slims or something like that, right? In terms of kids, we can see this really clearly, like in fast food meals. When I was growing up, if you went to the window, they'd say, do you want a girl's toy or a boy's toy? If we look at this McDonald's advertisement on the left, superheroes, blue background, we can assume that's marketed towards boys. What is the message there? Be heroes. So be industrious, be courageous, be a leader, be strong, right? That's the message that we're putting forth towards boys. On the right, pink background, we've got these Hello Kitty stamps. We can assume that's marketed towards girls or kids assigned female at birth. What's the message there towards the girls? Stamp up the cuteness. So be cute, be pleasing, be attractive, make people like you, be nice, right? So very different messages that are starting pretty early, right? This is stuff that like a preschool kid could play with. And then this little infographic I like, although I would say kids of all genders, but how to tell if a toy is for boys or girls, a guide. Do you operate the toy with your genitalia? If yes, this toy is for adults, not kids. If no, then the toy is for kids of all genders. So we can probably think about the ways that, ourselves, maybe in our past, we got feedback or information about what we were interested in, what we played with as kids. If we think about our kids or grandkids going to preschool, excuse me, did they get feedback about what they wore, whether their hair was too short or too long, what they wanted to play with, right? From either their peers or maybe even from teachers at that school, right? We also see gender expectations in things like roles. So meaning what kinds of tasks are performed in a family, in a community, in a professional setting. So for a family, who does the taxes? Who does the dishes? Who takes out the trash? Who takes care of the kids? Are those roles gendered in some way, and why? And how is that different from my generation to older generations, my parents and grandparents, and then younger generations, my kids and grandkids? What are the differences between what roles are taken on by people? We also can think about if I told you to imagine a CEO and a secretary, are those roles gendered and why? A doctor and a nurse, a makeup artist and a mechanic, right? Are we imagining people of a particular gender when I give you those occupations? And think about how you have been shaped to make those assumptions, right? So I invite you to think about gender expression is about how we express ourselves, but it's also about how we perceive people. So gender expression is the place where we get confused about someone's pronoun. We think we know what their gender is, and maybe we're seeing them from far away, or we're seeing them from behind or the side. And so we make an assumption that's wrong about their gender, or maybe we're only hearing them on the phone and we make an assumption about their gender that's wrong. Gender expression is also the place where we get confused about what is going on in terms of this person's sexuality versus what is going on in terms of this person's gender. So I'll give you an example here. So these are two kids, okay? Kid on the left, let's assume that she was assigned female at birth, likes to play sports. What might she be called on the playground or by her peers? A tomboy, right? I often ask folks, is tomboy a positive, negative, or neutral term? I think it's generationally specific. I think it's culturally specific. Any word can be weaponized, and tomboy certainly is a word that can be weaponized. And I know from me growing up, all of the other girls that I grew up with, we all played sports. So we all had been labeled as tomboys at one point or another. And it was more neutral. It was just sort of like, oh yeah, when you're wearing your athleisure, okay, that's when you're being a tomboy. What about kid on the right? So if we assume kid on the right was assigned male at birth, maybe he likes wearing dresses as pictured, maybe he likes playing with dolls. What might he be called on the playground or by his peers? Some more painful words, right? Maybe some F words that we don't want to say. Maybe sissy, something like that. Maybe he would be called gay or girly as an insult. So if you were working with these kids, or if they were part of your family, who would you be more worried about going to school or being out in society? I personally would be worried about the kid on the right. So I invite you to think about, from my vantage point, from a United States centered perspective, I find that girls and young women have more latitude to express their gender, right? It's very true that 100, 150 years ago, very controversial for women to wear pants. And there are still some communities in the US in which it's really controversial for a woman to wear pants. But also, most people I know, women I know, conservative, liberal, whatever, wear pants. It's no problem. It's a no-brainer. Having short hair for a woman, not necessarily super controversial. But for a boy or a young man to wear dresses, to wear skirts, to wear makeup, to wear wigs, regardless of how that kid identifies, that can invite a lot of violence, right? Doing work in schools, boys that are seen as more feminine are often targeted. They're assumed to be gay, whether they are or not. So even if this kid is like 5 years old, let's say, other kids or parents might call him gay, and he might have awareness of what his sexual orientation is, but 9 or 10 is usually the average first awareness for sexual orientation. So he might not be aware of who he has crushes on. He just might like wearing dresses and playing with dolls, right? So do you see how we often assume that gender nonconformity is associated with not being straight? And research shows that there is a little bit of a thread there, that some kids that are gender nonconforming have a greater likelihood of identifying as lesbian, gay, pansexual, queer, or transgender in the future. But also, if we were to think about our own lives, have you ever gotten feedback? Think about this. Have you ever gotten feedback as a child that something you were interested in, or the way that you expressed your gender, was different from what people might expect of you based on your sex assigned at birth? I know a lot of men who were told very early on, you can't cry, stop being a pussy, right? Man up, suck it up. That's because emotionality is considered a feminine behavior, even though we're all humans who have emotions that need to be released, right? I know a lot of women and girls that have been told, well, you won't be good at math. You're not going to be as good at math as men are, because that's naturally, something that men are better at. You probably won't be a CEO. Like, here's a more appropriate professional track, right? So all of us get feedback about, are we doing this boy or girl thing right? Are we doing this man or woman thing right? What duties should we undertake based on our gender? What things should we be interested in? What should we wear? Or how should we groom ourselves based on our gender? So I hope that you can do a little bit of reflection on that, like maybe even after the talk today. Just sit and think about what are your memories related to maybe being punished, being chastised, right? Given negative feedback based on your gender expression because someone thought that it wasn't appropriate based on your sex assignment at birth. A term that's really important related to gender expression, which we've talked about a little bit already, is this word gender nonconforming. So this just means whatever those gender expectations are in society, and often they are really rigid and binary. So men and masculine people do this, women and feminine people do that. Gender nonconformity refers to anybody who kind of moves between those categories. And the important thing to know about gender nonconformity, and hopefully what you got out of this little self-reflection that we did, is that all of us could be described as gender nonconforming at one point or another. And it's all about who's looking. So if we think about something like, I go to the grocery store, I see someone who has a beard who also has their nails painted. I might be thinking, I wonder if this is like a gay man or a drag queen. Maybe this is a trans woman. Or a non-binary person. Maybe this is a parent whose kid painted their nails. Maybe this is a person who's part of a goth or a punk subculture in which it's really common for men to paint their nails. But the point is, what are the questions coming up for me? Do I think it's unusual? Do I perceive it as unusual that a person with a beard has painted their nails? And then what are the assumptions that I'm making, right? If I'm going to talk to that person, what's the pronoun I'm going to choose? Will I say he because of the beard? Will I say they because I'm not sure? Will I try out she just to see maybe if this person wants to have she pronouns? Gender nonconformity is where we get mixed up about sexuality and gender. It's also about where we get mixed up about pronouns. Okay. So gender nonconforming, again, not necessarily folks that are part of the LGBTQ community. It could be any of us. I'll give just a quick example. I went to visit a friend in South Africa a few years ago, and I went with another friend who identifies as non-binary, but most people perceive them to be a woman, or at least at that time in South Africa, they were perceived as a woman. I got a flat tire. We took an 1,800-kilometer road trip around the entire country, and I got hit by a pothole. I hit a pothole and got a flat tire. So we called the car rental place and said, like, we need someone to come out and help us replace this tire. And my friend was the one talking on the phone, has a little bit of a higher voice. And the guy on the other end said, well, do you have a man with you? And my friend said, yes, I have a man with me. And they said, like, okay, well, then have the man change the tire. And I'm kind of saying, like, yeah, this is the classic thing of I'm supposed to know how to work on cars and I don't. And my friend was like, this man doesn't know how to change a tire. And so that's one of those instances, right, where there's such an ingrained assumption about our aptitudes and our interests related to our gender. And it might not be true. And there are real world consequences to those kinds of assumptions. Okay, lastly, so we're going to finish up third dimension of gender. We're going to talk about third gender categories, and then I'm going to pause and we're going to have some openness for questions. I still have more material if you don't have questions, but that's a preview of what we've got for the next about 10 minutes. So this third dimension of gender is gender identity. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's our deeply held internal sense of what our gender is. Again, for an overwhelming majority of people, this matches what our sex assigned at birth is. For some people, approximately 2 million Americans, it does not. Our gender identity does not match what our sex assigned at birth is. Most recent research, like let's say by the American Psychological Association, would say that between 18 months of age and 4 years of age is where we arrive at a firm sense of what our gender identity is. Now, this doesn't mean that a person's gender might not evolve over time. So like I shared, I realized that I was trans when I was 20. It put into context a lot of different discomforts and experiences that I had in my childhood and up until that point in my life. I also know people that didn't come out as trans or non-binary until they were 70 or 80. There are all kinds of stigmas and shame and factors that can limit someone's discernment about what their authentic gender identity is. But what that 18 months to 4 years of age really refers to is the cognitive capacity to recognize body constancy. So in cognitive development, the idea of body constancy is in the same way that a 4-year-old realizes, I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and be a puppy or a kitty. A 4-year-old also realizes, when I wake up tomorrow, I'm going to have the same body that I had today. And for a lot of kids, that's cool. Oh, okay, I have a penis. Great. I'm going to wake up tomorrow with a penis. For other kids, that might be the first moment that they recognize, oh, I'm going to wake up with a penis tomorrow, and everyone is still going to think that I'm a boy, and I'm not a boy. So maybe that's when distress starts to peak for some kids, and they might begin to say things like, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. Right. So when these questions come up, especially in political rhetoric right now around how could a child that young know their gender? How did you know your gender? Right. When you were 3 or 4. It's the same thing that there's a deeply psychological and also neurological piece of how we perceive our own bodies. A lot more research needs to be done, but there's some preliminary evidence that shows that trans people have some brain structures that are more similar to their gender identity rather than their sex assigned at birth. So meaning like for me, even before I started taking testosterone and transitioned, that perhaps I had brain structures that were more similar to boys and young men at my age, even though I was assigned female at birth and didn't have those same levels of DHT and testosterone in my body. So there's some evidence that there are brain differences that could be related to trans identity. However, that aside, right, I think a big thing that I want to impart is that research also shows that when folks are respected in terms of their gender identity, it's less stigmatizing, obviously, and it removes a lot of the mental health and well-being barriers that trans people experience from constantly not being respected, constantly not being seen for who we authentically are. All right, lastly, an important term to know related to gender identity is this word non-binary. So when we're thinking of the gender binary as there's male, there's female, there's nothing else, that idea that I explored with talking about sex assigned at birth, someone who is non-binary says, I don't believe in that system. I don't resonate with it. I'm not male. I'm not female. I'm not masculine. I'm not feminine. I'm beyond that in some way. Maybe I'm all of it, or I move fluidly between those categories, which is what this comic represents. So in this comic, the same person is being asked, are you a boy or a girl? So from the top left, are you a boy or a girl? No. Are you a boy or a girl? Yes. Are you a boy or a girl? What day of the week is it? Are you a boy or a girl? Great question. So non-binary is its own umbrella term. A lot of young people, maybe perhaps 25% of all LGBTQ folks that are in Gen Z and younger identify as non-binary. So this is something that if you're not already meeting folks in your life that identify as non-binary, it's something that you will probably see professionally, personally, in the work you do or in your lives. So again, that question of how can I best respect you? What does that mean to you is really important for someone who identifies as non-binary. I'm going to send you a YouTube link where a couple of different non-binary folks are interviewed. So if you'd like to watch that, it's a really good way to see like the wide diversity of what being non-binary means to people, how they might present and how that impacts them. Lastly, I wanted to circle back to, if you remember in that first slide, two-spirit was under sexual orientation and gender identity. I want to alert you to this social category that's called a third gender category. So this is a social category that exists in hundreds of different cultures throughout the world, on every continent except Antarctica, because human life did not spring from Antarctica necessarily, right? But a third gender category is a category for people that go beyond these male-female categories. So either they feel like they're neither male or female, they alternate between those categories, or are otherwise gender nonconforming according to their cultural norms. So the most common third gender category that people in the US are familiar with is two-spirit folks. So two-spirit is an umbrella term coined in the early 90s by dozens of North American indigenous tribes, so Native American folks, who wanted to create their own term to refer to gender fluid, gender nonconforming queer people in their tribes, because many of the writings about those folks in their tribes were done by European settlers using problematic language that misunderstood who folks were. So I'll put in the chat this word, Burdicky, is one of those words. That is a French word that means kept boy. So a French settler, colonizer, used that word to refer to these like feminine men that he saw in one of the tribes he encountered. And that word kind of persisted in the literature, and that label was put on folks without an understanding from that tribe's cultural perspective on who these folks were. So two-spirit, and this image is from the Bay Area two-spirit powwow that happens annually in the Presidio. Two-spirit refers to two things. One, a person who walks between these worlds of masculinity and femininity, but two, people that walk in the material and the spiritual realms. So what's interesting about third gender folks is that third gender folks from a bunch of different cultures that weren't necessarily mingling with one another in these understandings are often viewed as especially sacred. That there's some kind of special connection to the divine among people that move between these categories. Some of the earliest writings we have, like from Vedic texts, so texts from like Southeast Asia, often used in Hinduism, some early Buddhist texts, certainly ancient like Hebrew and Jewish texts, refer to the reality that there are multiple kinds of genders. There are 6 different genders in the ancient Hebrew language. In the Elder Testament of the Bible, and so the Torah in Judaism, there is mention of like eunuchs and people that are moving between these categories. And we're talking about, 4,000-year-old texts in some cases. So this is not a new idea, but white supremacy culture and colonization often erased the reality of these folks. So lastly, one example of that is hijras in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. This is one of those third gender categories that is ancient, very well known. Oftentimes folks assign male at birth, identify as female, or present as more feminine. Hijras are viewed as lucky, conferring blessings. They have a special connection to certain deities in Hinduism. And when the British Empire colonized India, there's a law called, I believe, Section 377 or 337 that outlawed anyone from dressing other than these strict kinds of dresses based on their sex assigned at birth. So hijras were made illegal in society. They were killed and could be killed and could be punished for presenting that way. And it's only in the last couple of years that that law has been changed. And so that's an example of how this white supremacy colonizing culture has erased a lot of these third gender categories that readily recognize not all people identify with their sex assigned at birth. Not only is that a normal part of human diversity in these cultures, but it's viewed as special, as something to protect and to honor. In many of these North American indigenous tribes that have two-spirit folks have to be present at certain ceremonies. They might name children. They might matchmake couples, right? They might confer certain kinds of blessings that cannot be given by other people. So I want to be really clear that this is not a new thing of being non-binary, of being transgender. And the two-spirit in particular, that might refer to someone who also is attracted to people of similar gender or like same sex. So in some tribes, it's a word that refers to sexual orientation, whereas in other tribes, it's a word that refers to gender, which is why it was in those two categories. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I know I went over a lot. So Jim, I would love to hear questions, and I can always toggle back to slides if that's helpful.
Boy, Kelsey, that was amazing. Thank you so much. You have an encyclopedic knowledge, my friend. I've been sitting here in awe of, and I've learned so much. So thank you for the sort of that taxonomy of just what these different words mean, because they come up a lot, and you're not quite sure, and you're a little reticent to explore because you don't want to offend anybody. So I just want to express just personally a deep gratitude for providing just kind of the fundamentals of this new world. And I think just an initial question is on the demographics of this. Is this something that you observe is like evenly spread in, say, the population? Is it more bi-coastal? Is it more of an urban phenomenon? You know, as you have sort of witness the emergence of all this gender fluidity, how is it manifesting where most predominantly? Is there any data on that?
There is. So I just put in the chat for the folks that are live a link to the US Trans Survey. So this was released in 2015. They're about to do another one, but it's the largest sample of trans people in the United States that's ever been done. It was 27,000 people. And so here's what I would say. So this survey, even though it's a large sample of trans folks, and there was another survey done in 2011, the National Trans Discrimination Survey. It was about 7,000 people. It was the largest sample at the time. Both of those reports have acknowledged we're not getting everybody who's part of this community, because it's really hard to reach folks that might be living on the street. Folks, a lot of things are done only in English, right? Not in Spanish, not in Mandarin, not in other languages. And so they both have said these are not representative surveys. So the truth is that we don't totally know the demographics of the trans community. I don't think I could speak with any certainty on that. But what we do know, as you might imagine, urban areas tend to have a higher concentration of trans people. That's not because trans people are only born in urban areas, right? So the story there is that you think about these state laws, right? There are states that have on the books not only no protections for trans people, but laws that actively put us in danger, right? And so, of course, people are going to move from that state to a more like liberal and accepting area where they'll be accepted. The Bay Area, New York, and I'd say other urban centers like Atlanta in the South is a really big hub. Maybe like Houston, although maybe less so now, like Chicago, those would all be places. Austin probably is anyway. those are probably places where there are high concentrations of trans folks, but that survey gives a geographical overview. But I do want to be really clear that that identifying as trans is something that transcends racial, ethnic identifications, religion, right? It's more about where is there less stigma, where people will be safer. And that's why there are higher concentrations in urban areas.
Yeah, yeah. And, in a related question, Kelsey, is the relationship between, I would say, sexual gender hostility and repression and race. The information I have is that of all the different categories that you've laid out, it's trans women of color that have suffered the most, certainly the most killings, at least that I know about. So speak to us just for a moment about this relationship between gender, race, and I would add, it's the same people that are passing the anti-trans laws, that are passing the anti-abortion laws, that are making it hard for people to vote. So that this isn't an isolated issue on its own out there. It's part of a toxicity in the psyche that has a lot to do with white supremacy, evangelical, fundamentalist religion, racism, of which the attack on gender fluidity is only an aspect. Does that ring true to you? What would be your comment on that?
I think that is well said. And I'm a white man, right? So I can speak to this in a way that is not part of my experience. I'm just going to put in the chat. There is a wonderful non-binary poet, activist, speaker named Alok Vaid-Menon, who, if you follow their Instagram, they do book reports on some of the history of how these intersections have existed in the past. So, I mean, the simple way, and just gives great interviews. So a simple way to look at what you're saying, Jim, is that trans women of color, so when we're thinking about like transphobia, so people that are afraid of, who hate trans people, that has a meaningful overlap with misogyny, right? The hatred of women or femininity. So thinking about the laws that are being proposed, it's coming from a perspective of femininity being devalued, which is why I would say in that one slide, I'd be more worried about the kid on the right who's assigned male at birth, is interested in wearing dresses, right? Is that when he's called girly as an insult, that's saying like, why are you being weak and passive? Why are you being like a girl, right? Being like a girl is a bad thing. And then there's the intersection of racism, which people of color, regardless of their gender identity, experience. So it's the intersectional, the layering on of oppression of race, hatred of women and femininity. So if you're a trans woman, you've got both of those going on, and you're a trans person who, if you're discovered, right, there are laws being proposed and passed that would make it legal for doctors and paramedics to refuse to treat a trans person in an emergency, which is terrifying. And Tyra Hunter, this happened to her in Washington, D.C. in the late 90s. And there was no prosecution, right? That person was just allowed to be left for dead because she was trans and a trans woman of color. So it's about, I think the work is thinking about this intersectionally. So as a white trans man, I want to be an ally and a voice for that. And I think it's also important to name that if you know anything about scientific racism, which is a really popular perspective within science, whether it's biology, but also social sciences like anthropology in the mid 1800s, ideas about the most civilized race included things like, well, African people are hypersexual and they're really fluid in their gender, and they're hyper fertile, so we need to control them. So there is a lot of writing from a Western perspective about how white Western European folks were the most civilized because they had these rigid gender categories. Men do this, women do that. And that was meaningfully connected to not only their lighter skin color, but also the idea that they're the most intelligent and sophisticated people on Earth. And through colonization, we can change these indigenous and Black and brown societies to have rigid gender roles, because that will make them less primitive and more civilized. And that's meaningfully related to the violence that is unduly centered on trans women of color, in my opinion.
Yeah, beautifully put. Thank you so much. Kelsey, tell us a little bit about what's going to go on tomorrow.
Yes, so we're going to talk about pronouns. How do pronouns enter this conversation about respecting gender identity? So some language around that, a little bit of history, but also what are some good practices to be respectful? As a person who's gotten people's pronouns wrong, it can be really stressful, right? And we're good people who want to respect. So how do we do that? And then the last 20 to 30 minutes, I'll be interviewing Dennis Barron, that linguist who will tell us a lot more about history of gender pronouns in English. And he's also going to talk about how gender pronouns are related to First Amendment fights that are happening currently in US politics.
Brilliant, brilliant. Kelsey, I am so glad we've had you on. You've done a masterful job today. I'm deeply grateful. And I think all of us are looking forward to day 2 of your 3-day program on the world of trans. Okay. That'll do it for all of us today, everyone. You're welcome to the after chat session. Kelsey's going to try to join, so you'll have a few minutes of informal dialogue with him. You'll see the link in the chat box. And for everyone else, we'll see you same time, same station tomorrow here on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.